Count 1, the charge of aggravated murder. We, the jury in this case, being duly impaneled and sworn, do find the defendant, Anthony Sowell, guilty of aggravated murder.
Cleveland police step through the front door of 122205 Imperial Avenue on October 29, 2009, and the odor hits like a wall. Officers cover their noses. One detective gags. In the upstairs rooms, flies cluster on windows. In the basement, plastic sheeting hangs like a curtain. Outside, the entire neighborhood has been complaining for months, told that the stench is from a nearby sausage factory. It is not. It is the smell of human decomposition, of 11 women murdered by the man who lives here, Anthony Edward Sowell, the Cleveland Strangler. He presents as a quiet, thin man in his 50s, a registered sex offender who keeps to himself in a decaying house on a struggling block. To neighbors, he's the odd man at the corner who sometimes passes by with a beer or a cigarette. To the women on the margins of the city, those battling addiction, poverty, and homelessness, he is another man offering alcohol, drugs, or a place to crash. Between 2007 and 2009, he turns that house into a killing ground. 11 confirmed victims, several survivors, at least 2 years of opportunities for the system to stop him, all missed. The house becomes a chamber of horrors, hidden in plain sight, a place where screams are dismissed as domestic disputes, and the overwhelming stench of decay is explained away as industrial meat processing gone wrong. Sowell is born on August 19, 1959, in East Cleveland, Ohio. He grows up in a crowded house ruled by a physically abusive mother and overseen by a cruel grandmother. Family members later describe beatings with extension cords and belts, children forced to strip naked and be whipped in front of others. Relatives say Anthony witnesses cousins being humiliated and assaulted, learns early that pain is power. The abuse is not occasional, it is systematic, a daily reality that shapes his understanding of human relationships. At 17, he joins the US Marine Corps, serving from 1978 to 1985. The structure hides the damage but doesn't cure it. He serves honorably, but returns to civilian life carrying the same violent impulses he left with. In 1989, he is convicted of attempted rape and sentenced to 15 years in prison. He serves 11 years before release in 2005. Upon release, he registers as a sex offender and moves into the upstairs of his stepmother's house on Imperial Avenue. The neighborhood is poor, heavily black, and over-policed, but it is the kind of place where missing women are too often dismissed as runaways or addicts who simply moved on. Between May 2007 and September 2009, Sowell targets women struggling with addiction or housing instability. He invites them inside for alcohol or drugs, then attacks, beating, raping, and strangling them. Some bodies he leaves in shallow graves in the backyard. Others he stuffs in crawl spaces, the basement, or under piles of debris. At least 11 women, ages 25 to 52, are murdered. Several others survive, escaping strangulation and reporting brutal assaults to police, who fail to connect the pattern. One survivor later tells police, "He choked me real hard because my body started tingling. I thought I was going to die." Another describes being invited in for a drink, then attacked without warning, strangled until she lost consciousness, waking to find Sowell calmly sitting nearby. The victims include Crystal Dozier, 35, last seen in May 2007. LaShonda Long, 25, disappeared in August 2008. Imelda Hunter, 47, vanished in April 2009. Talacia Fortson, 31, went missing in June 2009. Nancy Cobbs, 43, was killed in April 2009. Tonya Carmichael, 52, disappeared in November 2008. Each woman had a story, a family, a life. Each was failed by systems that should have protected them. For months, neighbors complain about the smell. They call the city, the landlord, and the health department. People blame the nearby sausage factory or a dead animal. A city inspector comes out. No one opens the house. The bodies remain. Sowell drinks on the porch and watches patrol cars roll past, knowing exactly what's rotting inside his walls. The psychological profile is clear. He targets the vulnerable, those society has already marginalized, those whose disappearances won't trigger immediate manhunts or media coverage. The breakthrough comes in late October 2009 when a woman tells police that Sowell invited her in, raped her, and tried to strangle her. She manages to fight him off and escape, running to a nearby residence for help. Detectives obtain a warrant and move in on October 29th. In the third-floor bedroom, they find 2 bodies wrapped in plastic. In the basement, more remains stuffed behind walls. In the backyard, shallow graves containing decomposing corpses. The forensic team works for days, cataloging evidence, photographing scenes, carefully extracting remains from the nightmarish landscape of the property. By the time the search is complete, 11 women have been recovered from the house and yard, all killed within a 2-year window. Sowell is arrested nearby on October 31st, 2009, after 3 days on the run. In custody, he shows little visible emotion, answering questions in a flat, detached tone. His capital trial begins in June 2011. Prosecutors present DNA evidence, survivor testimony, and the physical reality of the Imperial Avenue house. Jurors see photographs of the rooms where bodies were dumped, the rebar and lime used in the backyard, the plastic sheeting in the basement. They hear from women who survived attacks, who describe being strangled to the point of unconsciousness. They see autopsy reports detailing ligature marks, blunt force trauma, signs of prolonged suffering. The defense leans on childhood abuse, head injuries sustained during his military service, and possible mental illness, arguing for life instead of death. Defense attorneys bring in experts to testify about the lasting effects of childhood trauma, the neurological damage from head injuries, the way abuse can rewire a developing brain. But prosecutors counter with the calculated nature of the crimes, the pattern of victim selection, the deliberate concealment of bodies. In August 2011, the jury convicts him of 11 counts of aggravated murder and multiple counts of rape, kidnapping, and abuse of a corpse. They recommend death. The judge agrees, calling Sowell a predator who showed no mercy to his victims. Sowell spends the next decade on Ohio's death row at the Chillicothe Correctional Institution. Appeals fail one after another. His attorneys argue improper jury instructions, inadequate mental health evaluation, ineffective assistance of counsel. All are rejected by appellate courts. In February 2021, before any execution date is set, he dies at age 61 at Franklin Medical Center in Columbus, reportedly from a terminal illness. The Imperial Avenue house is demolished in 2011, razed to the ground in an attempt to erase the physical reminder of horror. The city plants grass where the house once stood. The physical structure is gone, but the street remembers. Neighbors still point to the empty lot, still tell stories about the smell that hung in the air for months. Was Anthony Sowell born evil, or did years of abuse and neglect twist him into something monstrous? The answer doesn't change the outcome. 11 women died in a single house while complaints piled up and were ignored. He will be remembered not just as the Cleveland Strangler, but as proof of what happens when a neighborhood's most vulnerable residents are treated as disposable, when complaints from poor black communities are dismissed, when the system fails to protect those who need it most. As we leave Cleveland, we travel to North London, to another building, another smell, and a drain packed with human flesh.
And because I was cooperating with the police, I decided I'll stick with it. Well, three of those victims were invented just to complement the continuity.
The manhole cover lifts with a metallic scrape. It is February 1983 in Muswell Hill, North London. A dino rod plumber named Michael Catron peers into a blocked communal drain at 23 Cranley Gardens. He sees something pale, congealed, and fibrous. Not grease, not fat, something else. The texture is wrong, the color disturbing. Later, telling the story, he remembers saying it looked like human flesh. One of the tenants, a soft-spoken civil servant named Dennis Andrew Nielsen, replies almost casually, "It looks to me like someone has been flushing down their Kentucky Fried Chicken." The comment is so absurd, so perfectly calibrated to dismiss concern, that Catron almost accepts it. Almost. Nilsen presents as a quiet, slightly awkward man in his 30s. He works at a job centre in Kentish Town, helping unemployed people find work, keeping meticulous records, filing paperwork with bureaucratic precision. He keeps a collection of music and books and drinks heavily in his small flats, often alone except for his dog Bleep. To neighbours and co-workers, he's lonely but harmless. A former soldier, a civil servant, a man who occasionally complains about noisy tenants but otherwise keeps to himself. In reality, between December 1978 and January 1983, he murders at least 12 young men, possibly as many as 15, strangling them in his apartments, living with the corpses for days or weeks, and then dismembering them with carpenter's tools and kitchen knives. Born November 23rd, 1945, in Fraserburgh, Scotland, Nilsen grows up in a fractured family. His parents separate when he is young. His father is largely absent. His beloved grandfather dies when Dennis is 6. Seeing the body laid out in a coffin becomes a formative memory, one he returns to again and again in his later writings. He later describes lying next to his own reflection in water, fantasizing about being dead but still conscious, about being a beautiful corpse. The psychological complexity is evident early, a child conflating death with love, loss with intimacy. He joins the army in 1961 at age 16, serves as a cook in the Army Catering Corps, and later works briefly as a police officer before becoming a civil servant. Throughout, he struggles with his sexuality in an era when homosexuality is still partially criminalized in Britain, with his sense of identity, drifting into isolation and heavy drinking in London. By the late 1970s, he is inviting vulnerable young men, often homeless, intoxicated, or estranged from family, back to his flat in Cricklewood, offering them a place to sleep, a meal, companionship for the night. From December 30th, 1978 to January 26th, 1983, Nilsen kills again and again. He strangles or drowns his victims, sometimes holding their heads under water in a bath while they are too drunk or drugged to resist. He then bathes, clothes, and arranges the bodies, occasionally talking to them or watching TV alongside them, treating them as companions who cannot leave. At his first address, 195 Melrose Avenue, he hides bodies under the floorboards and in cupboards, later burning remains in the garden on bonfires, watching the flesh blacken and the bones crack in the heat. When he moves to Cranley Gardens in 1981, he no longer has access to a private garden. He begins boiling heads and limbs in large cooking pots on the stove, cutting flesh into small pieces that he flushes down the shared drains or throws out with household rubbish. The victim count is officially 12, with some sources suggesting up to 15. Among the identified victims, Stephen Dean Holmes, 14, killed in December 1978. Kenneth James Ockenden, 23, a Canadian tourist murdered in December 1979. Martin Duffy, 16, killed in May 1980. Graham Allen, 27, killed in 1982. The most disturbing element is not just the necrophilia or the post-mortem rituals, it is the fact that other tenants live above and below, sharing the same pipes as the dead, complaining about the smell but never imagining the true source. The investigation begins with that blocked drain. After Catherine's discovery, he returns the next morning with his supervisor to clear the blockage properly. By then, someone has partially cleared it. Suspicious, they contact the police. Detective Chief Inspector Peter J. arrives. Human tissue and small bones are retrieved from the pipes and confirmed as human remains. Officers trace the drain line back to the top floor flat. When they knock on Nilsen's door on February 9th, 1983, he initially tries to deflect, suggesting the remains might be from the medical student who lived there before him. But quickly, almost with relief, he folds. "It's a long story," he reportedly says. "It goes back a long time. I'll tell you everything." He takes detectives through his flat, pointing out where bodies are stored, describing in calm, methodical detail how he killed, what he did with the remains. A search uncovers 3 dismembered bodies stored in plastic bags in wardrobes, with charred remains and bone fragments from earlier victims later identified at Melrose Avenue. The confession is exhaustive, Almost compulsive, Nielsen seems eager to finally tell someone, to unburden himself of the secret he's carried alone. His trial opens at the Old Bailey on October 24th, 1983. The key issue is not whether he killed, he has confessed in detail, provided diagrams, walked police through crime scenes, but whether he is legally sane. Prosecutors argue he knew exactly what he was doing, that the careful dismemberment and disposal show clear planning and awareness. The defense claims diminished responsibility due to mental abnormality, arguing that only an insane person could commit such acts. Witnesses, forensic experts, and Nielsen's own statements paint a deeply disturbing picture of methodical killing, dismemberment, and concealment. Psychiatrists testify about his personality disorders, his need for control, his inability to form normal human attachments. On November 4th, 1983, the jury finds him guilty of 6 counts of murder and 2 of attempted murder. He is sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 25 years, later converted to a whole life tariff by the Home Secretary, meaning he will never be released. Nielsen spends the rest of his life in English prisons, including HMP Wormwood Scrubs and later HMP Full Sutton. He writes extensive notes and memoirs, filling thousands of pages with reflections on his crimes, his childhood, his psychology. Some of these writings are published posthumously. He becomes the subject of books, documentaries, and dramatizations, including Brian Masters' definitive biography, Killing for Company, the ITV drama Des starring David Tennant, and the Netflix documentary Memories of a Murderer, the Nielsen Tapes. He dies in custody on May 12, 2018, at age 72, after suffering a blood clot and internal bleeding following surgery. He is cremated and his ashes scattered at sea, with no memorial. Was Dennis Nielsen driven by loneliness and self-hatred, or was that just how he justified a desire for absolute control over the vulnerable? He turned shared plumbing into a graveyard and a quiet flat into a morgue, while neighbors argued over blocked drains and strange smells. The psychological question remains unanswered. Can someone commit such horrors and still be considered fully human? From here, we move from a London bedsit to a Texas boarding house, where another neighbor will end up in pieces in the water, and a wealthy man will one day mutter, "Killed them all, of course." In Galveston, Texas, the neighbor is dressed as a mute woman. Robert Allen Durst, heir to a New York real estate empire worth billions, rents a small room in a cheap boarding house in 2000 under the alias Dorothy Signer. He wears wigs, dresses in women's clothing, and mumbles that he's deaf to avoid conversation with other residents. Living down the hall, 71-year-old Morris Black, a gruff, solitary neighbor with a temper and a history of confrontations. The two lonely, difficult men form an odd, volatile pairing in the shabby house on Avenue K. In September 2001, bags of human body parts are found floating in Galveston Bay. They belong to Black. Within months, Durst will be on trial, not just for killing his neighbor, but for what he did afterward. To the world, Robert Durst is not some anonymous tenant. He's the eccentric eldest son of Seymour Durst, born April 12, 1943, into a family that controls billions in New York real estate through the Durst Organization. The family owns major Manhattan properties, skyscrapers, apartment buildings, commercial real estate that generates millions annually. As a child, he witnesses his mother's apparent suicide, falling or jumping from the roof of the family home in Scarsdale when Robert is 7 years old. Some accounts suggest young Robert was called to the roof and saw her body on the ground. Family members and experts later suggest this trauma scars him deeply, creates psychological fractures that never heal. Over the decades, he becomes linked to three major cases: the 1982 disappearance of his wife, Kathleen McCormick Durst, the 2000 execution-style murder of his friend and confidant, Susan Berman, in Los Angeles, and the 2001 killing and dismemberment of his neighbor, Morris Black, in Texas. In 2000, as scrutiny mounts over Kathy's disappearance and New York authorities reopen the case, Durst drifts. He has access to millions, but chooses to hide in poverty. He winds up in Galveston, renting a shabby room for a few $100s a month and presenting as a mute woman named Dorothy. The disguise is elaborate but imperfect. Neighbors notice the masculine build, the odd behavior, the expensive car parked outside a cheap boarding house. Black lives in the same house, a cantankerous older man known for confrontations with other tenants. The two lonely, difficult men form an odd relationship, sometimes cordial, sometimes hostile. On September 30th, 2001, something in that boarding house explodes into violence. Durst later claims that Black, who had allegedly discovered his true identity, came at him with a gun. Durst says he wrestled the weapon away and the gun discharged accidentally, killing Black. What is not in dispute is what happens next. During his 2003 trial, Durst calmly testifies that he used a paring knife, 2 saws, and an axe to dismember Black's body. He describes the process in clinical detail, cutting through joints, separating limbs, wrapping parts in garbage bags. He places the parts into garbage bags and dumps them into Galveston Bay, weighing some down with weights. Black's torso and limbs are recovered, floating near the shore. His head is never found. Without the skull, prosecutors cannot definitively prove the manner of death beyond Durst's version. A struggle gone wrong, a gun fired accidentally. He is charged with murder, but his lawyers argue self-defense and panic dismemberment. "I did dismember him," he tells the jury matter-of-factly. "I did do that." Police connect Durst to the floating remains through mail and receipts leading back to the boarding house. His room contains blood evidence, tools, and documentation linking him to the disposal. He is arrested, then infamously jumps bail despite wearing a GPS monitor and flees. He is eventually captured in Pennsylvania after shoplifting a sandwich from a grocery store despite having $500 in cash in his pocket, a detail often cited as proof of his bizarre risk-taking and psychological need to be caught. In November 2003, the jury acquits him of murder, accepting that prosecutors have not disproven self-defense beyond a reasonable doubt. The jury foreman later explains they believed something violent happened, but couldn't be certain Durst intended to kill Black. In 2004, he pleads guilty to bail jumping and evidence tampering for dismembering Black, receiving a 5-year sentence and serving about 3. Durst's story doesn't end there. In 2015, HBO's documentary, The Jinx, The Life and Deaths of Robert Durst airs, examining all 3 cases connected to him. Filmmaker Andrew Jarecki conducts extensive interviews with Durst, who agrees to participate despite his legal troubles. In the now famous finale, Durst goes to the bathroom still wearing a live microphone and mutters to himself, "What the hell did I do? Killed them all, of course." The line, discovered in post-production, becomes a cultural shockwave, replayed endlessly on news programs, analyzed by forensic psychologists, debated by legal experts. The hot mic moment helps reinvigorate the investigation into Susan Berman's 2000 murder. Prosecutors in Los Angeles charge him with her killing, alleging he shot her execution style to prevent her from talking to investigators about Kathy's disappearance. In 2021, after a trial interrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic, a California jury convicts him of her murder, and he receives life without parole. New York authorities then charge him in his wife's presumptive death, though her body has never been found. Durst dies in a California prison hospital on January 10, 2022, at age 78, before any further trials can occur. He succumbs to cardiac arrest while serving his life sentence. Robert Durst remains a paradox, a man with immense resources who chooses squalid boarding houses and petty crimes, a neighbor who could turn lethal, dismember a body with carpenter's precision, and still walk free for years. Was he a damaged son, acting out patterns of family trauma and maternal loss, or a calculating narcissist who believed rules did not apply to him because of his wealth and privilege. Either way, Morris Black, a cranky, lonely old man, paid the price for living down the hall from him. Leaving Texas, we head to Florida, to a fenced-in Jacksonville yard neighbors call a house of horrors.
And plenty of times walking in and out of court, file in hand, but today he'll face potential jury members. According to the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, this all began on May 20.
From the air, the house looks like a fortress. In Jacksonville, Florida's south side, a property on Patricia Lane is surrounded by high fences, barbed wire, junk, and makeshift barricades. Neighbors call it the House of Horrors, and its owner, Russell David Tillis, the neighbor from hell. They report constant noise, screaming, fights, and threats. Children are told not to walk past the property. Some residents cross the street to avoid it entirely. For years, it's just a menacing presence on the street, until police start digging in the backyard and uncover the dismembered remains of Joni Gunter, buried in shallow graves. On paper, Tillis is a chronically violent offender. He has prior arrests, restraining orders, and a reputation for cruelty documented in police reports stretching back years. In practice, he is simply the terrifying neighbor everyone avoids, the one whose yard is filled with rusting car parts, broken furniture, and threatening signs. The neighborhood is used to calls to police, to officers showing up and then leaving again when no immediate crime is in progress. People know he brings women, often vulnerable, struggling with addiction or homelessness, onto the property. They suspect abuse, but suspicion isn't evidence. Some women are seen arriving and never seen leaving, but without missing person reports or witnesses willing to testify, police cannot act. Publicly, he's the man with the junkyard yard, the one who screams, swears, and threatens people from behind his fence, who films neighbors with surveillance cameras and posts warning signs about trespassers. Privately, prosecutors say he is a predator who lures women into a trap, a property fortified not just against intruders, but against escape. The sense of entitlement is clear. This is his corner of the street, his chaotic kingdom, and no one, neighbors or police, is going to tell him what to do or who he can bring home. The key victim we know about is 30-year-old Joni Gunter. In 2015, her dismembered remains are found buried in Tillis's backyard during a police excavation. Investigators believe she was lured there, attacked, killed, and cut apart before burial. The property's layout, fencing, junk, and barbed wire makes it difficult for anyone to see in and easy for screams to be dismissed as more of the same neighborhood drama. Rumors of other women circulate through the community, stories of women who went into that house and were never seen again. But Gunter is the case prosecutors can prove with physical evidence. The horror is amplified by geography. Families make dinner in neighboring kitchens while a woman is hidden in shallow graves just feet away. Children play in yards separated only by a chain-link fence from a burial ground. The investigation into Tillis ramps up after a 2015 incident in which he allegedly tries to attack a Jacksonville officer during a welfare check, leading to his arrest on assault charges. While in jail awaiting trial, another inmate tells detectives that Tillis confessed to having a body buried on his property, bragging about getting away with murder for years. Officers secure search warrants and bring in forensic teams with ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs. Excavations uncover Gunter's remains, along with physical evidence tying her death to Tillis, clothing, personal items, DNA evidence, photographs of the backyard, the pits, the discarded debris, the fencing confirm what neighbors have been whispering about for years. His trial finally takes place in 2021 after years of delays and legal maneuvering. Prosecutors present DNA evidence, testimony about the backyard dig, and witnesses describing Tillis's violent behavior toward women. The jailhouse informant testifies about the alleged confession. The defense suggests the informant is unreliable, a convicted criminal seeking favorable treatment, and tries to create distance between Tillis and the killing, arguing that others had access to the property. But jurors are unmoved by the defense's theories. In April 2021, they find him guilty of first-degree murder and kidnapping in Gunter's death. A second phase considers whether he should be executed. The jury cannot unanimously agree on death. In June 2021, the judge sentences him to 2 consecutive life terms plus 30 years, sparing him the death penalty but ensuring he will die in prison. Tillis now serves his sentences in the Florida prison system at Reception and Medical Center in Lake Butler. His house has become a symbol in local memory, a warning about what can fester behind a problem property when complaints and calls never solidify into decisive action, when authorities treat neighborhood feuds as civil matters rather than potential danger. Russell Tillis forces an uncomfortable question. When a neighbor's behavior is openly frightening, when children are told to avoid a house, when screams echo regularly, how much evidence do authorities need before they act? In this case, a whole street lived in fear until a woman's body was found in the ground. From a fortified yard in Florida, we moved north to Minnesota, where another man turned his home into a fortress, not to hide a crime scene, but to create one.
Conversations between Smith and police. There were 2 of them, just over an hour long. Smith was candid and cool during the interviews. His voice did start to quiver when he gave a play-by-play of...
The audio recorder is running when the first shot fires. On Thanksgiving Day, November 22nd, 2012, in Little Falls, Minnesota, Byron David Smith sits in a basement chair with a book, a Ruger Mini 14 rifle, and a .22 caliber revolver within arm's reach. The house at 1102 Elm Street is quiet. Outside, the sky is grey, and most of the small town of 8,000 people is gathering around turkey dinners. But Smith isn't expecting family. He's expecting intruders, and he's ready. At 12:33 p.m., 17-year-old Nicholas Brady enters through a basement window. Smith fires twice. Brady tumbles down the stairs. Smith stands, walks over to the teenager's body, and fires a 3rd shot beneath his jaw. "You're dead," Smith mutters into the recorder he'd set up hours earlier. Minutes later, 18-year-old Haley Kiefer calls down to her cousin Brady. She hears nothing. She climbs through the same window. Smith fires. Kiefer falls down the stairs, gasping. Smith drags her body next to Brady's. She's still alive, groaning. Smith retrieves his .22 revolver and fires a shot under her chin, what he later calls a good clean finishing shot. Then he wraps both bodies in a tarpaulin and drags them into his workshop. He doesn't call police. Not that day, not that night. He waits until the next morning, nearly 24 hours later, when he phones a neighbor and asks him to report the shootings. When asked why he waited, Smith says he didn't want to bother police on a holiday. The audio recording captures everything: Smith's heavy breathing, the gunshots, Brady's fall, Kiefer's voice calling out, the final execution-style shots, Smith's cold commentary. When police play the recording in court, jurors hear a man who wasn't simply defending his home, he was executing teenagers. Byron David Smith was 64 years old when he killed Brady and Kiefer. He was a retired security engineer for the State Department who'd worked overseas in embassies. He lived alone in a modest 2-story house on a tree-lined street in Little Falls, a town where everyone seemed to know everyone. Smith had been burglarized before, multiple times. His home had been broken into at least half a dozen times over the previous months. Prescription medications, cash, and gold coins were stolen. He'd reported the thefts to police, installed security cameras, and grown increasingly paranoid. Neighbors described Smith as quiet, intelligent, and increasingly isolated. Some said he'd become obsessed with the burglaries, convinced that local teenagers were targeting him. Others said he'd changed after retirement, becoming more withdrawn and fixated on security. He'd started parking his truck blocks away from his house to make it look unoccupied. He'd set up surveillance equipment and motion sensors. On Thanksgiving morning, he moved his truck, turned off lights, set up the audio recorder, and settled into his basement chair with loaded weapons. When police arrested Smith the day after the killings, he didn't deny shooting. Brady and Kiefer. He claimed self-defense. Minnesota's castle doctrine, he argued, gave him the right to defend his home against intruders. But the audio recording told a different story. It revealed a man who'd been waiting, possibly even hoping, for the confrontation. A man who executed wounded teenagers instead of calling 911. A man who delivered finishing shots to victims already incapacitated. At trial in April 2014, prosecutors played the full audio recording. The courtroom heard Brady's body tumbling down the stairs, Kiefer's voice calling to her cousin. The final shots fired at close range while both teenagers lay wounded on the floor. Smith's voice, calm and cold, "I refuse to live in fear." Then, after Kiefer's final shot, "I want him to go away, not me." The defense argued that Smith had snapped after months of burglaries and fear. They portrayed him as a man driven to desperation by repeated violations of his home and police inability to stop the break-ins. They emphasized that Brady and Kiefer were in fact burglarizing his house when they died. Security footage showed both teenagers had participated in earlier thefts from Smith's property, but prosecutors focused on those execution shots, the bullets fired after both victims were already down, wounded, and helpless. They argued Smith had set a trap and waited like a hunter in a blind. The recorded evidence showed premeditation, not panic, overkill, not self-defense. The jury deliberated less than 3 hours. On April 29, 2014, they convicted Byron David Smith on 2 counts of first-degree premeditated murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Smith showed no emotion when the verdict was read. The case divided Little Falls and sparked national debate about self-defense laws, castle doctrine, and the limits of homeowner rights. Some locals saw Smith as a victim himself, a man pushed too far by teenage criminals and an inadequate justice system. Online commenters debated whether homeowners should have unlimited rights to defend their property. Gun rights advocates cited the case as an example of self-defense laws being undermined. But legal experts pointed to a fundamental principle. Once a threat is neutralized, the right to self-defense ends. The teenagers who broke into Smith's home were committing a crime, but that crime didn't carry a death penalty. And even if it had, Smith wasn't authorized to serve as judge, jury, and executioner. The execution-style shots fired into already wounded victims crossed the line from defense to murder. The audio recording remained the most damning evidence, not because it documented the shootings, but because it captured Smith's state of mind. His calm, his preparation, his commentary, the finishing shots delivered with methodical precision. When Smith told investigators he wanted the teenagers eliminated, he revealed the truth. This wasn't about stopping a burglary, it was about permanent elimination of perceived threats. Byron David Smith's home at 1102 Elm Street no longer exists. It was demolished in 2015, the lot cleared and left empty. Neighbors had complained about the property becoming a macabre tourist attraction, with curiosity seekers driving by to photograph the house where it happened. The Little Falls community wanted to erase the physical reminder of Thanksgiving 2012, but the case itself couldn't be erased. It became a cautionary tale cited in legal debates about self-defense, a case study in criminal law courses, and a grim example of what happens when fear, isolation, and anger collide with firearms and opportunity. The audio recording, released to the public during trial, remains online. A permanent and disturbing record of the moment self-defense became execution. Nicholas Brady and Haley Kiefer were troubled teenagers with criminal histories. They'd burglarized homes, used drugs, and made bad choices that Thanksgiving Day. But they were also children, 17 and 18 years old, who deserved to face criminal charges, not summary execution in a basement. Their families described them as kids who'd made mistakes, not monsters who deserved to die. Byron David Smith sits in prison today, serving consecutive life sentences at Minnesota Correctional Facility in Oak Park Heights. He maintains that he acted in self-defense, that the justice system failed him, and that he had no choice but to protect himself the way he did. His appeals have been denied. The audio recording continues to contradict his claims. In the end, Smith's case illustrates a dark truth about the castle doctrine gone wrong. Your home is your castle, but you're not entitled to be its executioner. The law allows defense, not revenge. Protection, not premeditated killing. When Smith pulled those triggers the first time, he may have been defending his property. But when he delivered those final, close-range shots to wounded teenagers on his basement floor, he became exactly what he feared most, a threat that needed to be stopped. The recorder captured it all, the shots, the falls, the final executions, and Smith's own words preserved forever, "I refuse to live in fear." In trying to eliminate his fear through violence, he eliminated 2 young lives and his own freedom. The house on Elm Street is gone, but the recording remains, a permanent testament to the moment a neighbor became a killer and self-defense became murder. From a Minnesota basement where fear became execution, we moved to a Georgia apartment complex where a law student's polite next-door neighbor secretly filmed her through the window before killing her.
Now, in McDaniel's habeas, he claims that Floyd Buford, Frank Hogue, and the rest of his defense team failed to represent him effectively. Here's what Buford had to say today about that.
He looks directly into the camera and pretends to be concerned. On June 30th, 2011, local news in Macon, Georgia, interviews a disheveled law student named Stephen Mark McDaniel about his missing neighbor and classmate, 27-year-old Lauren Teresa Giddings. Standing outside their building, Barristers Hall near Mercer University's law school, he tells the reporter how worried he is about Lauren, how strange it is that no one can find her. Mid-interview, the reporter interrupts him with breaking news. A body has been found in a trash bin at the complex. McDaniel freezes, his face draining of color, stares off camera, and whispers, "I think I need to sit down." The reaction appears genuine, but by that point, according to prosecutors, he already knows exactly whose body it is, because he's the one who killed and dismembered her just days earlier. Publicly, McDaniel is the weird but harmless neighbor, an awkward, highly intelligent Mercer University law student who keeps to himself, collects guns and survivalist gear, and talks obsessively about grades and exams with classmates. He graduates in May 2011, passing all his classes but failing to make many friends. Privately, he's harboring a fixation on Lauren, who lives on the other side of his wall in the adjacent apartment. She is friendly but reserved, focused on her studies, preparing for the Georgia bar exam. On June 26, 2011, just days after graduating from law school, she's murdered in her own apartment in what prosecutors will describe as a sexually motivated killing. Lauren is born April 18, 1984 in Maryland and moves to Macon for law school at Mercer. Friends describe her as driven, funny, and compassionate, with plans to become a public defender, to advocate for those who cannot afford representation. She wants to make a difference in the criminal justice system. McDaniel, born in 1985, grows up in Georgia, excels academically throughout his education, but remains socially isolated, struggling to form normal relationships with peers. Classmates later recall his unsettling comments about women and fixation on specific female students. Investigators will discover videos shot from outside Lauren's windows, voyeuristic footage indicating that he had been watching her in secret for months, tracking her movements, learning her routines. In the early hours of June 26, 2011, prosecutors say McDaniel uses a master or copied key to enter Lauren's apartment while she sleeps. He attacks her, strangling her to death in her own bed. Over the next day or two, he dismembers her body in her bathroom using a hacksaw purchased weeks earlier, placing her torso in a green trash bin just outside the apartment complex. Other parts of her body are never definitively found, possibly disposed of in other locations or the Ocmulgee River nearby. When friends cannot reach her, they report her missing on June 27th. Police arrive, search the complex, and eventually discover the torso in the trash bin on June 30th. At first, McDaniel plays the concerned neighbor, giving interviews, joining searches, and talking about how nice Lauren was, how he hopes she's found safe. But detectives quickly become suspicious of his demeanor and inconsistencies in his story. His story changes, his affect is off. He seems to know too much about the investigation. A search of his room reveals a key to Lauren's apartment, packaging for a hacksaw purchased at a hardware store, and internet searches on topics including how to break into a girl's house and how to dispose of a body. Digital forensics uncover voyeuristic videos of Lauren's windows filmed from his apartment. Faced with mounting evidence, he is arrested on July 1st, 2011, and charged with murder, burglary, and evidence tampering. In April 2014, to avoid the death penalty, McDaniel pleads guilty to malice murder. In court, he admits to killing Lauren and moving her body, though he offers little explanation beyond vague claims of anger and obsession, refusing to provide details about motive or what he did with the missing body parts. He is sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Given the brutality and premeditation and the fact that he has shown no remorse, parole is far from guaranteed. McDaniel is currently incarcerated in the Georgia Department of Corrections at Hancock State Prison. The interview clip, him reacting in real time to the discovery of the body he himself dismembered, continues to circulate as a chilling example of a killer inserting himself into a case, playing the concerned friend while knowing the horrible truth. Was Stephen McDaniel a socially stunted misfit who exploded into violence, or something darker, a man who rehearsed the fantasy of killing his neighbor until he finally acted on it? The evidence suggests the latter, the pre-purchased tools, the voyeuristic surveillance, the copied key. Either way, Lauren's murder is every tenant's nightmare. The idea that the person stepping out of the door next to yours is watching you, planning to cross the threshold, waiting for the moment you're most vulnerable. From a law school hallway, we move to a quiet San Bruno cul-de-sac where a petty dispute ends with a 77-year-old neighbor in buckets and chemical baths. From the outside, it looks like a quiet Bay Area street. College students from nearby Skyline College live nearby. Families walk dogs in the evening. But inside one San Bruno house in February 2017, 51-year-old David Brian Stubblefield is fighting with his elderly neighbor, 77-year-old Benjamin Roybal, over something as trivial as a space heater. The appliance is old, possibly broken. Who paid for it? Who owns it? Who gets to keep it? Within hours, Roybal will be dead, shot and dismembered, his body parts stored in containers while Stubblefield tries to dissolve them with chemicals in a desperate attempt to hide the evidence of murder. Neighbors know Stubblefield as a troubled presence, a man with a criminal record, prone to arguments and instability, someone who gets into disputes over parking, noise, and property boundaries. Roybal, by contrast, is known as helpful and kind, someone who once testified in a different dismemberment case years earlier, a grim coincidence that prosecutors will later note in court. The two men live on the same San Bruno block near Skyline College. Their lives intersect over small favors, errands, and, eventually, property and belongings, including that heater that becomes the flashpoint for violence. Details of Stubblefield's earlier life emerge mainly through court records and police reports. He has prior convictions for violence and property crimes, a pattern of volatility and poor impulse control that stretches back years. By 2017, tensions with neighbors are nothing new. Multiple residents have complained about him. Roybal, in his late 70s, has his own routines and frustrations, but nothing suggests he's in danger. Until the day he and Stubblefield clash over heat and payment, until a disagreement that should have been resolved with a conversation turns deadly. According to prosecutors, an argument erupts in February 2017 over the cost or return of a space heater. The details are petty, the kind of dispute that happens in neighborhoods every day, but Stubblefield pepper sprays Roybal during the confrontation, escalates the conflict with physical violence, and ultimately shoots him dead with a handgun. Instead of calling police or fleeing, he drags the body inside his house and begins a gruesome cover-up. Over the next hours or days, he dismembers Roybal with saws and knives, placing parts in buckets and containers, adding chemicals, possibly drain cleaner or other corrosive substances, in an attempt to break down tissue and bone to make the body unidentifiable. Neighbors walk by outside, unaware that a man they know is cutting up their friend just a few feet away behind closed curtains. When Roybal is reported missing by concerned family members, San Bruno police begin checking on his last known contacts and movements. Suspicion quickly falls on Stubblefield given the history of disputes. Officers obtain a warrant and search his home. Inside, they find containers with human remains in various stages of decomposition, evidence of chemical attempts at dissolution, and items belonging to Roybal. DNA testing confirms the remains are Roybal's. Stubblefield is arrested and charged with murder and related counts. In March 2018, Stubblefield pleads no contest to second-degree murder with a firearm enhancement as part of a deal that avoids a trial but guarantees a long sentence. In May 2018, a judge in San Mateo County sentences him to 40 years to life in state prison. Prosecutors and local media described the case as spine-chilling, stressing how a trivial dispute over a household item escalated into calculated dismemberment and attempted chemical dissolution of a body. Today, Stubblefield remains in the California Department of Corrections at California State Prison, Corcoran, unlikely to ever be released given his age and sentence. For Royball's family and neighbors, the horror is permanent. A man they saw every day, a helpful neighbor, was shot, cut apart, and placed into buckets in a house they passed on the way to work, all over an argument that should have been forgotten within minutes. How does a disagreement over a heater turn into a homicide? In this case, the ingredients were already there: a history of violence, access to weapons, and a willingness to see a neighbor not as a person, but as a problem to be erased. From this California cul-de-sac, we go to Ocala, Florida, where a woman who called herself the perfect neighbor ends a years-long feud with a single shot through a closed door.
The 60-year-old woman who opened fire through her front door and shot a neighbor dead is convicted of manslaughter. Relatives of the 35-year-old victim could be seen weeks.
The door is closed when the bullet leaves the gun. On June 2nd, 2023, in Ocala, Florida, 35-year-old Ajike A.J. Owens walks to the front door of her neighbor, 58-year-old Susan Louise Lawrence. Minutes earlier, children had been playing in a nearby field, enjoying a summer evening. There are allegations of thrown objects, insults, and threats shouted across yards. Owens, a black mother of four, wants to confront the woman who, her family says, has repeatedly yelled at and cursed her kids, who has made their lives miserable for over 2 years. When she knocks on the door, Lawrence stays inside, behind a locked, windowless door. She fires a single shot through it with a .380 caliber handgun. The bullet passes through the solid door and strikes Owens in the chest. Owens collapses in front of her children and later dies at a local hospital, leaving 4 children without a mother. For years, Lawrence has described herself as the perfect neighbor, frequently calling the Marion County Sheriff's Office about noise, children playing, and supposed harassment. Records show multiple complaints involving her and nearby families, a pattern of escalating tensions documented in incident reports. Owens's children, who live just across the way, have been on the receiving end of her anger more than once, accused of being too loud, of trespassing, of disrespecting property. To some residents, Lawrence is the woman who keeps the neighborhood in line, who isn't afraid to call out bad behavior. To others, she is a powder keg, volatile, allegedly using racial slurs, weaponizing 911 calls as a form of harassment against black neighbors. Owens is born in 1987. Friends and relatives describe her as a loving mother, working hard to raise 4 kids on her own, trying to provide stability and opportunity in a community that should have been safe. She and her children move into the Marion County community seeking stability, not expecting their neighbor to be a lethal threat. Over roughly 2.5 years, tensions with Lawrence escalate, disputes over children playing in common areas, accusations about property damage, a pattern of simmering hostility documented in police reports that seem to show a disproportionate focus on Owens's black children. On June 2nd, 2023, the long-running feud erupts for the final time. According to witnesses and charging documents, Lawrence yells at the children playing near her property, throws a pair of roller skates at them, hitting one child, and uses threats and possibly racial slurs. Owens comes to Lawrence's door to confront her about the assault on her child, knocking and demanding she come out and explain herself. Lawrence stays inside, claims she is afraid for her life, and retrieves a handgun from inside her home. Without opening the door, without confirming who is outside or whether they are armed, she fires one round through the solid metal door. The bullet passes through and into Owens's chest as her children watch in horror. Deputies, already en route to a trespassing call made by Lawrence herself, soon receive a second call about shots fired. The killing triggers national outrage and protests. At first, Lawrence is not immediately arrested, as investigators evaluate whether Florida's controversial stand, your ground law, could apply, whether a person can claim self-defense for shooting through a closed door at an unarmed person. Civil rights attorney Benjamin Crump, who has represented families in high-profile cases across the country, and community members demand action, arguing that Owens was unarmed and simply knocking on a door, that she posed no actual threat. Under mounting pressure, and after interviewing witnesses and reviewing evidence, authorities arrest Lawrence on June 6, 2023, charging her with manslaughter with a firearm, culpable negligence, battery, and assault. At a press conference, Marion County Sheriff Billy Woods stresses that the law does not justify shooting through a locked door at someone who poses no imminent threat, stating, "This situation is a prime example of when it was not justified. It was simply a killing." In August 2024, after a 2-hour deliberation, an all-white 6-person jury finds Lawrence guilty of manslaughter with a firearm, rejecting her self-defense claims. Prosecutors argue that she acted out of anger and prejudice, not genuine fear, and that her conduct showed a depraved disregard for human life. On November 25, 2024, she is sentenced to 25 years in prison, close to the 30-year maximum. She begins serving her time at Homestead Correctional Institution in South Florida. The case becomes the subject of Netflix's 2025 documentary, The Perfect Neighbor, which uses 911 calls documenting years of complaints, body cam footage from the night of the shooting, and interviews with family members and community activists to reconstruct the years-long conflict and its deadly end. For Owens' family, no sentence can make up for what her children saw. Their mother dying on the doorstep, shot by the neighbor who claimed to want a peaceful community. Was this a case of an anxious woman pushed too far, or of prejudice and entitlement cloaked in the language of self-defense? The jury's answer is clear. Lawrence's actions were unjustified, criminal, motivated by anger rather than fear. A closed door became both a physical barrier and a moral test, and when Lawrence pulled the trigger, she failed both. From Florida, we turn to another neighbor feud that turned deadly over something equally trivial: barking dogs. The argument starts over barking and ends with 5 shots. On March 12, 2012, in Flagler Beach, Florida, 52-year-old construction worker and father Dana Mulhall stands near the white picket fence separating his home from that of his neighbor, 66-year-old Paul Miller. They've argued before about Miller's barking dogs, voices raised over the fence, complaints about noise levels, threats, and counter-threats. That evening, voices rise again in yet another confrontation. Witnesses later testify that Miller walks back into his house, retrieves a .38 caliber handgun, hides it in his waistband, returns outside, and fires 5 times at close range. Mulhall is hit multiple times, including in the back as he turns away. He dies on the grass across from the Atlantic Ocean, in a town that sells itself as laid back and peaceful, a beach community where the worst problems should be parking disputes and noise complaints. Miller is known around the neighborhood as a gruff, opinionated man who dislikes noise and confrontation he can't control, someone with a short fuse and strong opinions. His dogs, however, are frequent barkers, causing complaints from multiple neighbors. Mulhall, who lives next door, complains about them repeatedly, asking Miller to keep them quiet, to train them, to bring them inside at night. Friends describe Dana as outgoing and friendly, someone who enjoys the beach town lifestyle, who works hard and wants to come home to peace and quiet. The tension between the two men builds over months, escalating from irritation to mutual resentment, from cold stares to heated arguments. Born in the mid-1940s, Miller moves to Flagler Beach later in life, drawn by the slower pace and ocean views, seeking retirement tranquility. But he brings with him a short temper and a strong sense that his property is his castle, that no one can tell him what to do with his dogs or how to live his life. Mulhall, a younger neighbor, has his own expectations about peace and quiet, about neighborhood courtesy. Neighbors see arguments, hear shouting matches over the fence. It's the sort of conflict almost every community experiences until one person decides to introduce a gun into the equation. On March 12, 2012, the dispute erupts again in the early evening. Prosecutors say the two men argue across the white picket fence about Miller's barking dog, exchanging insults and threats. Miller later claims he believes Mulhall may be armed or threatening violence, that he fears for his safety. Evidence and witness testimony tell a different story. Miller goes inside his house, takes a .38 revolver from atop a curio cabinet, conceals it in his waistband, returns outdoors, and, during the confrontation, shoots Mulhall 5 times at close range, including as he turns away to leave. Mulhall falls on his own property, mortally wounded, bleeding out on the grass as neighbors call for help. Police arrive quickly, responding to multiple 911 calls about gunshots. Miller does not flee. He stands near the fence and claims self-defense when officers arrive. He is arrested and charged with second-degree murder. The case draws significant media attention as yet another example of Florida's gun culture and stand-your-ground controversies, a minor neighborhood dispute spiraling into lethal violence. At trial in May 2013, prosecutors argued that Miller acted out of spite and anger, not fear, pointing to the number of shots fired, their trajectory showing Mulhall was turning away, and the history of ongoing anger over the dogs. The defense insists that Miller believed Mulhall might be reaching for a weapon, that he feared imminent harm. Jurors watch reenactments of the shooting, see the fence line and distances involved, and listen to audio of 911 calls from that night. On May 24, 2013, the jury convicts Miller of second-degree murder with a firearm, rejecting his self-defense claim. In June 2013, a judge sentences him to life in prison without possibility of parole. The court rejects his self-defense claim, effectively ruling that walking back inside to arm himself and then firing multiple times at a man who was turning away was an unjustifiable escalation of force. Miller remains in the Florida prison system, serving his life sentence and occasionally appearing in appellate news as he challenges his conviction and sentence. For the residents of South Flagler Avenue, the white picket fence where 2 grown men once shouted about dogs is now a crime scene marker in memory, a reminder that small grievances can turn deadly when anger meets a firearm. How much is a quiet yard worth? In this case, the answer was a human life, paid for in bullets over barks that could have been resolved with noise, ordinances, or animal control. From a seaside town, we travel north to Pennsylvania, where another older neighbor decided that a wooden shed was worth ambush and murder. The dispute is literally over a shed and a driveway. In Ridley Township, a suburb of Philadelphia, neighbors Scott Robbins and James Jim Della Vecchia clash for months over a new shed and driveway construction that Robbins is building on his property. Robbins, 42, is building an addition for his family, including his 23-year-old stepdaughter, Kristen Snow, trying to add living space and improve the property. Della Vecchia, 73, believes the work encroaches on his property line and blocks access to his driveway, making it harder for him to maneuver. He calls the police repeatedly, files formal complaints with the township, and stews in growing resentment. On the morning of October 10, 2011, he takes a .40 caliber handgun, lies in wait near the property line, and opens fire on Robbins and Snow as they leave for work. Robbins is killed instantly. Snow is critically wounded but survives. Della Vecchia is the classic aggrieved neighbor, an older man who believes property lines are sacred and any perceived slight is a personal attack on his dignity and rights. Over time, his frustration over Robbins' shed and driveway escalates from annoyance to obsession, consuming his thoughts and conversations. He documents the construction, photographs every stage, and complains to anyone who will listen. Robbins, a father and worker at a local medical equipment company, tries to move on with his life, following township codes and permits, believing that the worst he'll face is more yelling over the fence or perhaps a zoning hearing. Public records show that Della Vecchia's resentment builds throughout 2011 as construction progresses. He's angry about water runoff, noise during construction, and perceived encroachment on his property. He calls police multiple times, attends zoning meetings to object, and tells others that Robbins has deliberately ruined his life and destroyed his property value. He even installs a security camera pointed at the neighbor's property, documenting every perceived violation. Instead of diffusing his anger, each step of bureaucratic process seems to harden it, to convince him that the system won't protect him and he must take matters into his own hands. On October 10, 2011, he acts on that anger. Prosecutors later tell jurors that Della Vecchia lies in wait near the driveway early in the morning, armed with a loaded handgun. As Robbins and Snow walk out around 6 a.m. to head to work, he steps forward and fires multiple times without warning. Robbins is hit several times in the torso. As he lies on the ground bleeding, Della Vecchia shoots him again at close range, ensuring he is dead. Snow is also shot but survives, gravely injured with permanent physical damage. Neighbors call 911, describing an execution-style shooting. Bleeding and near death, Robbins identifies my neighbor as the shooter before losing consciousness. Police go directly to Della Vecchia's home and arrest him without resistance. In September 2012, a Delaware County jury convicts Della Vecchia of first-degree murder, attempted murder, aggravated assault, and related firearm offenses after a trial that presents overwhelming evidence of premeditation. At sentencing in December 2012, the judge calls him a danger to society who deserves to die in prison and imposes life without parole, plus at least 7 additional years on the other charges. Della Vecchia shows little visible emotion as the sentence is read, sitting stone-faced in the courtroom. He later challenges his conviction in state and federal appeals, arguing ineffective assistance of counsel and claiming the evidence doesn't support first-degree murder, but the core facts remain undisputed. An elderly man transformed a property line dispute into a planned ambush and execution. In June 2020, he is found dead in his cell at state prison at age 77, reportedly from natural causes. What does it take for a shed to become a motive for murder? In Della Vecchia's case, it required years of grievance, an unwillingness to accept compromise or legal resolution, and the belief that violence could solve what zoning boards and conversations could not. From Pennsylvania's property lines, we step back to see the larger patterns, to understand what these cases reveal about the darkness that can lurk behind the most ordinary facades. Across these 10 stories, one pattern repeats with disturbing consistency. Evil often arrives with a friendly wave or a petty complaint. These are not stories of masked strangers jumping from bushes or serial killers hunting in the night. They are stories of proximity and proximity's dangers. Shared walls, shared pipes, shared fences, shared streets. Neighbors whose names were on mailboxes, whose routines were visible through thin curtains, whose voices carried through apartment walls. In almost every case, there were warning signs ignored or dismissed, complaints to police that went nowhere, weird smells explained away, volatile behavior tolerated, threats dismissed as empty, voyeurism undetected, escalating disputes treated as civil matters. People noticed, neighbors saw, authorities were called. But noticing isn't the same as intervening, and even when authorities were called, action often came too late after bodies were already buried or boiling. We don't choose our neighbors in most cases, but we choose how seriously we take early signs of danger, stalking behavior, explicit threats, unexplained screams in the night, a child saying they feel unsafe next door. Persistent strange odors, escalating conflicts that feel disproportionate. We choose whether to shrug off the smell or ask why it's there and demand answers. We choose whether to escalate or step away when a fence line or noise complaint becomes heated beyond reason. We choose whether to intervene when we see warning signs or tell ourselves it's not our business. If these 10 cases have one shared message, it's this: the most dangerous person in your life might not be a stranger at all. It might be the person whose porch light you can see from your bedroom window, whose car is parked next to yours every day, whose footsteps you hear through the ceiling. Evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just knocks on your door. Sometimes it lives on the other side of your wall. If you found this exploration into these shocking cases compelling, please hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications for more true crime content. Which of these killers do you think was the most disturbing? Share your thoughts in the comments below.